Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everybody, to the We're Not Lost Private podcast. My name is Joe Muccia, and this is episode 26. And on this episode, I've got a couple of special guests, Joe Hook and Edwin Popken, who are going to, we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion about Operation Pegasus. For those of you who are Band of Brothers fans, you've obviously seen it portrayed in a small manner. And not really a very comprehensive manner, but there's only so much they can cinematically show. And there was some stuff left on the cutting room floor, but really what we're talking about is the historical cutting room floor. And we're going to talk about the entire operation. We're going to scene set it. We're going to talk about key players. We're going to walk through both the disposition of forces on both sides of the Rhine, and then we're going to talk about the rescue itself, and then the follow-on items. But it's a pleasure to have Joe and Edwin on here. They're both outstanding historians and guides, and they have been working on some special projects of late. And you guys have just come back from some pretty heavy traveling.
Yeah, we've just come back from Poland. We only came back a couple of days ago, bearing in mind that we were there a week. Exactly, we went to Auschwitz, and we were in Auschwitz exactly a week before its 80th liberation. It was a pretty heavy day. The weather matched the heaviness of our surroundings because the fog closed in, and it had a profound effect on both of us.
Yeah, I would imagine so. As we spoke about before we went on air, it's places like that that really weigh heavily on your heart and your morale, your own internal morale, and how you view the war. But we understand, a lot of the guys that I talked to that were served towards the end of the war and were part of the liberation of camps, especially, with my relationship with the Easy Company men in Landsberg and dealing with that. And I know that from our chat before we went live, how much it affected you guys. I mean, that's I think a lot of people kind of tend to view, especially folks who go on tours, sometimes places like that. And I know from my tour guiding, we don't usually get out there, and because I like to end my tours on a high note, but the why we fight component is very, very much a vital piece to this, right? And I think you guys saw that firsthand.
Yeah, we did. I mean, for me, it was the first time I'd been to Auschwitz. Ed has been there once before, but I think this time is second time around for Ed, and first time for me was more in depth. We had a private guide, and there were two reasons for going. First of all, I've been interested in the history of the Holocaust since I was at school. I remember my mum talking about the kinder transports coming into England as early as, the mid-1930s. And they came into England not too far from where we're sat here in this kitchen now. But so I wanted to go and see it for that reason, for the historical purpose. But there was a secondary objective to our visit, and that is because through his middle son, so Ed's middle son, Tim, played football with a young Dutch boy, and his father, a guy called Matan, is Jewish, and he is the nephew, he would have been the nephew of two young boys called Ado and Lex Horneman. Now, Ado and Lex Horneman lived in Eindhoven with their mother and father. Their father was an employee of the Philips electronics factory, which employed a lot of people. And so it had quite a good job, quite a tight family unit. And then obviously in 1940, Holland or the Netherlands are invaded, and everything changes for them. Now, the owner of the Philips factory was a bit like a Netherlands, touching on a Netherlands Ottger Schindler, because he wanted to protect his workers. They were essential war workers. But eventually the whole family, as a family unit, were, being Jewish, were rounded up and sent to Vurt concentration camp. And from Vurt concentration camp, the father went to Germany to work in munitions as an essential worker. And the mother, Bet, and the two boys, Ido and Lex, stayed in Vurt. And unfortunately, they were eventually deported to Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, the mum died. She died of typhus. But as we all know, the name Joseph Mengele, he singled out the two boys along with a number of other young children. And in Auschwitz, they were fed, they were given nourishing food, they were given toys, they were looked after. For one single reason is that one of Mengele's cohorts, a guy called Heisemeyer, these kids had been earmarked for experiments for tuberculosis. And they had to be healthy, they had to be looked after, they had to be fit in order for these experiments to take place. And Ido and Lex, along with a number of other children, I think it was 60 of them, were taken to Neuengamme. And there in Neuengamme, they were injected with tuberculosis in the most horrific fashion. They became sick, and for some of them, Heisemeyer performed operations on them, horrendous operations like cutting out their lymph nodes to see the effects of tuberculosis. And in April 1945, these children, with the advance of the Allies, these children are ordered to be executed, and they're taken to a school near Hamburg, and they were hung. And because they were so emaciated, they were so sick, when they were hung, some of the SS troops who hung them had to literally hold on to their ankles to provide the weight to hang them. And this story came out to us through children, really. Ed's son and Martin's son was the connection, other children 80 years later, that made the connection that eventually was a secondary objective for us going to Auschwitz. And when we were there, as I said to you earlier, the weather closed in and it was getting dark. It was about 4:30 and it was a bitterly cold day. And uniquely, we were the only ones left at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the weight, the oppressive weight of the weather and why we were there and what happened there really affected me. And I still feel quite, affected by it. But we placed 4 tulips there, tulips being one of the national flowers of the Netherlands, for Bet, for Philp, and for Lido and Lex. Ido and Lex Warneman. So that was a secondary reason for going to Auschwitz. But I would say to anyone, please go, because this story, not only their story, the story of the Holocaust needs to be told, but possibly prepare yourself, because I didn't realise, and as we were saying before, we deal in an industry where death is very close to life. I spend most of my life in cemeteries, but I honestly didn't realise how unprepared I was for it's the only place I've ever been to where you can feel evil.
Yeah, I think it's obvious, it's absolutely horrifying what happened to those children. And to me, most people, when they think of the Holocaust, it's a number, right? They assign a number, like this many millions of Jews, this many millions Catholics, etc., murdered by the Nazis. And I think one of the things I've noticed over the years, which engages people and forces them to engage, is when you personalize a story. You
Yes.
take it from the overview, from the cloud level, and you bring it down to the ground level, and it allows them to associate to it. And and I think, and I've talked about this in previous episodes back when Leighton and I were doing this together. We talked about how the popularity of Band of Brothers stems from everyday people being able to look at the men speaking before the episode starts and then speaking throughout the episodes as somebody they might have known, their grandfather, their father, their uncle, somebody they knew. And I think that once people do that, they tend to get an ownership of the story. and they tend to internalize it and it becomes more important to them. It forces them to or forces them in a good way to do research and to learn. And I think when you point out a story like the story of the boys, and how that very small piece of the millions that died spoke to you, and you internalized it, and it became very important to you, and it led to you having even a greater understanding of how evil the Nazi regime was and what they did to people, innocent people. And I
Mhm.
think that I think if more people do that, especially if they are preparing to go to a place like Auschwitz, I
Mhm.
think that it'll be much more rewarding for them. Will it be much more depressing and heartbreaking for them? Yes, most likely it will be, but it will allow them to empathize even more clearly with what transcribed there or
Yeah,
happened there.
I
Uh,
absolutely agree with you there, Joe, because we also had our own private guide in Dachau. Knowing how important it is being in the industry, of course, for all of us to have a good guide and showing you around and finding those places, finding those stories. We employed a really good guide there, and she took us
no,
around there.
Auschwitz, not
Also,
Dachau.
no, oh, sorry, no, I mean Krakow. Sorry,
Yeah.
I said Dachau, I meant Krakow, and she showed us around also in the Jewish, old Jewish quarter, also the Jewish ghetto, and she had a lot of personal stories,
Yeah.
didn't she? And that really, it's just amazing. And especially if you do like we did, first Krakow, the Jewish quarter, just normal Jewish life back before the war, then the ghetto, and then the next day you get to Auschwitz. We already got that build up to,
You follow their journey.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's very difficult, but I think also it's in a very important journey to make, at least for me personally,
Mhm.
and reminded, as you also said, the title of the episode, "Why We Fight." They couldn't have
Yeah.
chosen that title better,
Yeah.
because places like Dachau, places like Neuengamme, Mauthausen, Auschwitz, so many other places that really show why this was a just war and why it needed to be fought.
Yeah,
And to
I
bring
think
that,
and I think General Eisenhower is smart enough at the time to make sure everything was documented,
Mm,
because there are so many people out there denying that it ever happened, and we have film and photographic evidence of the atrocities and the evil nature of the Nazi regime. You have to commend him, obviously, um, well in the future, but you have to commend him for his foresight in knowing that it all had to be documented, because like a lot of history, it'll slip from the minds of everyday people, and
mhm.
then it'll be forgotten. And in this case, it can't be forgotten. Like we have our National Holocaust Museum here in the States, um, which I've visited, and it's a very heartbreaking museum to go to. But I think it has so much value in understanding, like when we look at a regime and how they deal with their citizens, and not even their citizens, they're conquered people in this case for Germany. Um, it's vital. It's
and
vital
to
to have
bring,
that history recorded.
and to bring that story full circle, Martin, Ed's friend, has now set up an exhibition to all those children
In Eindhoven.
that were brutally murdered. It's in Eindhoven. So if any of your guests are visiting Eindhoven, or through you or what have you, that you need details of that, we would urge people to go and visit it.
It's right in city
It's
centre.
right in the city centre. Tiny little exhibition, but it needs visiting. So if
So
anyone in the Netherlands.
So when this episode drops on this coming Wednesday, we'll make sure that we have vital information posted in the episode description. So if anybody is traveling to Eindhoven and wants to visit, I highly recommend it. Basically, if Joe and Edwin recommend anything, I'm going to highly recommend it. I'm going to foot stomp it hard. That's how much respect I have for you guys and your work. And on that note, we're gonna pivot to the main topic of the show, and we're gonna start talking about Operation Pegasus. And obviously, we have to do the scene setter. And this is, you guys are much more well versed on the First Airborne Division's participation, and I'm gonna I'm gonna leave it to you guys to set that scene, and then we start talking about the especially the 101st Airborne and everyone's favorite company and regiment. I can provide some details. I also set up a quick PowerPoint that has photographs of most of the rescue force from Easy Company. There were a few of the boys that I either couldn't get good enough quality photos or couldn't get photos of at all. Just a few of them, but for the most part, I think I've got everybody covered. But with that said, let's talk about how we get to the point where Operation Pegasus is necessary.
Yeah. So, the story really starts actually at near or at the end of Operation Market Garden, and for some of the main participants even before that. So, of course, Operation Market Garden ends officially on the morning of the 26th of September, 1944, as the remnants of the British Airborne Forces have retreated the previous night, the night of the 25th on the 26th, back across the Rhine from their perimeter north of the Rhine River, back into Allied-held territory. And I always stress, because I always get a lot of questions about it, I always stress this is as much retreat as the Allies did. They didn't retreat all the way back into Belgium. What was liberated remained liberated. Moreover, that became a huge stepping stone for liberating the south of the Netherlands before the end of the year.
Now, this was as much as a political decision as a military decision. Is that correct? I would say the decision was made, first of all, like you said, they don't want to retreat. They don't want to give up ground that they've taken. They also don't want, I know militarily they did not want to leave essentially an army with no place to go, but politically, you couldn't abandon what has been liberated to that point. The political fallout, the social fallout to it would have been horrific, because the Nazis would have come back in and slaughtered everyone.
It would have been, I guess, but also I think that's never been consciously decided to not do it. It was just not a question. The armies were there to defeat the Germans, to defeat Nazism. They were not going to fall back voluntarily. So in that sense, yes, there was some political side to it, but not the conscious one, in my opinion, at least. There was a conscious military decision, of course, to get the remnants of the 1st British Airborne Division back from north of the Rhine, because the British Army at that point in time, there are loads of reasons for that. We can't go into those rabbit holes now. There was loads of reasons why the British ground forces were not able to get across that final river. And they're certainly not at the point where the British forces then were, which is about 5 miles west of Arnhem, in that place called Oosterbeek. Now, as the Allies have retreated, or as the British remnants of the British Army have retreated back across the Rhine, and just allow me to mention the numbers here, out of almost 10,000 British airborne troops, little over 2,100 British airborne troops retreated back across the Rhine, plus a number of other troops that were also, not Polish airborne, some British ground forces that had been coming across the river in the previous nights. So in total, 2,400 soldiers made it back across. So if you just do the maths, it's less than 25% that comes back of that British airborne division. But there are still a lot of British airborne troops behind enemy lines. Some of them escaping and evading actively. Some of them taken prisoner by the Germans and will escape at a later moment, looking for opportunities. Some of them being wounded and being treated in medical facilities and are looking, as they recuperate, to also escape and evade. And that will lead literally in the days and weeks after, literally directly after Market Garden, as the 101st Airborne Division takes over that part between Nijmegen and Arnhem, we call the island, right? And at least in military terms, in geographical terms, it's not called the island in the Netherlands, of course, but we always refer to it. During that period, as the 101st Airborne Division is moving into that area, there are a couple of hundred people hiding in loads of different places with Dutch underground. And of course, the Germans know that they're there, so they're actively hunting,
Yeah.
trying to hunt them down, and that becomes a massive problem. And I think one of the men that is heavily involved in that entire story is a guy who was a very close friend of Joe's, actually. So I think maybe Joe wants to say a couple of words about him and how he got involved.
Yeah, so one of the guys in hiding is he was 1st Parachute Brigade Major, Major Tony Hibbert.
Mhm.
Tony Hibbert, I knew him, and the very first time I met Tony Hibbert was when I took the Parachute Regiment Association of Cornwall, because Tony Hibbert came from Cornwall on a tour, and I think it was back in 2004. It was a long time ago. Anyway, when I first met Tony Hibbert, he said to me, Joe, are you going to be at Brummen? And I kind of thought, I don't know what he's talking about. I'd never heard of this place, Brummen. It didn't play any part in my Operation Market Garden thinking, but not wanting to look ignorant, I went, yeah, okay. And then just very quickly looked it up on a map. And the reason why Tony wanted to go to Brummen is this. When all the defence at the Arnhem Bridge failed on about the 20th, 21st of September, those that are left at the bridge are taken prisoner. And a lot of them are initially put on a prisoner transport, taken up to a place called Velp, which is just north of Arnhem. And there they're processed, their name, rank, and number, interrogated, not to the extent that we think about interrogation, but asked to give information. And the majority of them won't give any information. They give their name, rank, and number, and that is it. And from Velp, the majority of them, now I say the majority of them, there's one man, a guy called Tony Dean Drummond, who is also part of the 1st Airborne, that I probably will touch on later. But the majority of them are then, after having been processed at Velp, are put on lorries and taken towards Germany, obviously to be taken to prison camps. And there's various stories, but these lorries get a little bit north of Velp and they stop. And there's various theories as to why they stop. One of the theories is to take on water. There's other theories, but whatever, it doesn't really affect our story. They stop, and the German guards form. Now, what Tony told me, the German guards formed a defensive circle around the lorries to stop anyone escaping. And Tony then saw it is his opportunity to escape. And he decided to, and he told me this, and again, there's other theories, but he told me that he vaulted across 2 of these German guards, using their soldiers to heave himself up, and then broke through into the crowd. It's a Saturday. It's market day in Brummen. And very quickly, people catch on to what's happening, and they close in around Tony, and he manages to escape. What he doesn't realise, his then story goes in, he escapes, he gets in touch with the Dutch underground, and eventually will get in touch with another larger-than-life character called Major Digby Tatham Walter, who I'm probably think you're aware of, but if anybody's not aware of Major Digby Tatham Walter, he's the man at the bridge with the umbrella. And together, which will come out in our story, they begin the plan for Operation Pegasus, Pegasus 1, the evacuation across the Rhine. But what Tony didn't realise is that because of his escape, and I'm trying to think of the name of the other guy who escaped with him, it'll come back to me in a minute. Because of that, again, there's theories, one of the Germans panicked and opened fire, or we're told that they executed a number of British troops, and those troops were executed in Brummen, just outside the post office. There's a memorial there today, which is just off the main market square. And Tony didn't know about this until after the war. And when he found out about it, he said to me, and he said this to me, he said, "Jo, I felt personally responsible for their deaths." And right up until he died, Tony would therefore always go to Brummon and put a wreath there. Now, Tony eventually passed away, like all the veterans sadly now are very quickly passing away. And when we were back up in Brummon, myself and Ed, during COVID, when we were filming something during COVID, I was really pleased to see that there was a wreath at the post office on behalf of Tony Hibbert, laid by the Hibbert family. So that is his story about getting to Brummon. But it's touching back on the other story. I mentioned another guy at Velp called Tony Dean Drummond. Now, Tony Dean Drummond, for those of you that have watched the film A Bridge Too Far, he is the officer that is in charge of signals during Market Garden. So probably not the most favourite if you want to believe all the stories we hear about.
All the urban legend, right, that
the
exists
urban
about the
legend,
communication. Yeah.
About the radios at Arnhem. Now, Tony Dean Drummond, he's another larger than life character, but not as well known as Tatham Water. And Tony Dean Drummond is fighting. He doesn't get to the bridge. Okay, so he's fighting to relieve or trying to get to the bridge when the Germans put in place a blocking line from north to south, about a mile to the west, maybe a kilometre to the west of Arnhem Bridge, blocking any relief to the bridge. And Tony Dean Drummond probably gets one of the furthest.
Was that Conf Group Spindle?
Yeah, they get it brought with Spindler.
Spindler blocking, correct. And they probably get furthest. They're on and around the area, which is now whether you have the Nelson Mandela Bridge, that circular bridge, the other bridge that comes into Arnhem. And they get they go into hiding in a room where the only place they think they can feasibly hide is a toilet. And Tony Dean Drummond is there with another, I think there's about 3 of them. And they put the engaged sign on in the toilet to make it look like somebody's using, because the Germans come into this property, try the door thinking somebody's on the loo, and they don't go any further. And there's 3 or 4 paratroopers hidden inside this toilet.
Well-mannered German troopers.
Yeah. But obviously they know they can't stay there for very much longer. So Tony Dean Drummond, and this is after the bridge has fallen and after the evacuation, Operation Berlin across the Rhine, thinks, right, how am I going to get back to British lines? So he himself decides to swim the Rhine. He swims the Rhine and he gets to the part of the railway bridge on the southern side, which is now under German command. And it's getting light, and first light, last light, every single army operates stand to. And he falls into a German slit trench. Now, again, there's theories as to whether he shoots a German. In his own testimony, I can't find it, but some people will tell you he does shoot a German soldier, but eventually he's captured. He gets put on the lorries, same lorries as Tony Hibbert, that get taken to Velp. Now, Tony Dean Drummond, when he's in Velp, and Tony Dean Drummond is an escape artist of magnitude. He's escaped before Operation Market Garden, but in Velp, he's in this very tall, grand Dutch house, and in this room where they're being processed, it's covered in wallpaper. Okay, the whole room, even a cupboard door, and he thinks, okay, what's in this cupboard? And he manages to see what's inside the cupboard, but it's quite a good hiding place. And with another one of the troops, he says, right, get a bit of the wallpaper off and cover up like the keyhole and everything so that he's completely covered. And whilst the others are being processed and put on this lorry, he takes in with him a loaf of bread and some water and hides in this cupboard. And I think it's about 4 foot by about 6 foot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really small.
And
he stays there for days, doesn't he?
He stays there for 13 days. The British are taken off to obviously to prisoner of war camps in Germany, But this building is still occupied by Germans. So he's in this cupboard while the whole building is still being occupied by German soldiers. He can't.
I mean, these are hair-raising stories. I mean,
Yeah.
you
know.
think about it, you put yourself in these positions, and that's what I ask my listeners and viewers to do is, as you talk about them, have you think about what you would do in this situation. You know,
Mhm.
how long is that loaf of bread and that water going to last between two men in that small little confined space with
Yeah.
Germans crawling all over the building?
Yeah.
And you can't make
Yeah.
a sound because you don't know how thick the walls are and what they
No.
can hear. I mean, it's just mind-boggling when you think about it.
Exactly.
And your bodily functions will remain operating, right?
Yes, it's not like you got a
No,
place to, hey, I got to go out to the loo and
no,
No,
nope,
No.
you
he says in his book, he's got a book called One Way Ticket, which is his memoirs, well worth a read. He said, I was quite surprised the amount of little water I was taking on, yet I was still able to urinate and bodily functions were still working.
man.
But he does realise that he has to find some way out. And he plans that he's going to escape possibly at night time. And after 13 days, he has he listens, this room that he's in, he listens and he can hear, the night he plans to escape, he can hear a German snoring on the bed. So he thinks, oh God, how am I going to sort of like escape on this night? But at the same time, there are some other Germans who've met some local girls. They come in, they start making a lot of noise. They go upstairs, put on a gramophone player, making lots of noise. So this sleeping German leaves, and he uses the cover of that noise and these
Yeah.
guys upstairs to escape. He escapes through the window, climbs over a hedge comes over the window into the garden, and then heads in a kind of a southerly route. And I think the first thing, it's September time, there's orchards that are still full of apples, and he helps himself to a load of apples. And he said they tasted the best apples I'd ever tasted.
Nothing like freedom on your taste buds, right?
But he's on his own, and at that point, you don't know who is your enemy. The Dutch, although there were a lot of very, very brave Dutch people, there was a lot of people that collaborated. And he just literally took the chance to knock on a door of a local farmhouse. And they agree to hide him. And in a shed in the garden, there's a place with straw. And they say, okay, don't hide there because that's the first place the Germans will look. And they put him under some old sacking in this shed. And the Germans, knowing that British soldiers are in the area, having escaped, they raid this shed. So the shed he's in. The first place they look at is the place where he's told them to hide. He eventually gets in touch with the Dutch resistance via these people that have hidden him, and he's told to leave this shed because obviously these people who are sheltering him, if they get caught, it's execution for them. And they get in touch with, I think it's a priest or something like that, and his instructions are to follow the railway line until you get to this area, which he does, and eventually, after all that, he's another one of these and manages to get in touch with the Dutch underground through one man that is running the whole of the Dutch resistance, which Ed will touch on later on. And he again gets in touch with Digby Tatham Water, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And slowly, gradually, all these men who've escaped, and there's a large number of them that have escaped. We could talk to you
A couple of hundred
all night about some various stories and various Dutch people who are courageous, take them in, look after them. And bearing in mind these people, the Dutch people, they're being rationed. They've got very little access to sort of like weapons or anything like that. So they're sharing their homes and their rations with sometimes a number of men who are all bunched together, but very good.
And starvation has been widespread across the Netherlands at this point,
Yeah,
right?
but the real starvation, the famine.
Doesn't take
that
hold.
happened in the western part of
Yeah.
the Netherlands, so the Holland provinces, so around the big cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, not in this part of the Netherlands. And that would be during the winter of 44-45, right? This
Yep.
is all before that is
Yep.
taking place. But of course,
Now-
there are shortages. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I'm sure you're going to talk about the resistance, Edwin, but I'm probably I'm probably just pinging this a little too early, but I'm thinking about the communication networks between the cells and how robust that is, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. I know the phone system still works, and I know the clergy is a big piece of this, but I think once you get rolling on the resistance portion of this, it definitely would help to understand, like, how are the cells talking to each other? How's it being coordinated? Because we touched on it early. When the rescue does go down, it's over 100 folks that come across. But you, like, as you talked about, Joe, you can't have them all in one place.
No.
It'd be too easy for the Germans to round them up. So they have to be parceled out and then brought back together. And that coalescence is going to be a real problem for the Dutch resistance, but they pull it off. But please, I know I probably stole your thunder on a little bit of this stuff, but I'd definitely want to get into that.
Oh yeah, but no problem at all. Of course, yeah. Well, technically, when you talk about resistance, the main resistance group that is actually involved in this is the resistance group of a town called Ede. Now, Ede is a couple of miles west of Arnhem, past Oosterbeek. So for those who know a little bit of the area, if you go from Arnhem, you go west, you go past Oosterbeek on the Amsterdam road, you get to the Ginkelde Heath. The drop zone of the 18th of September. If you go past that heath, literally on the side of that heath, on the western side of that heath, there is a town called Ede. That's where a lot of that resistance is, which is getting heavily involved. And they were very active. And already during the latter days of Market Garden, they started to, specifically, they start to observe the St. Elizabeth Hospital. Hospital where such heavy fighting took place, because a lot of British wounded soldiers end up in that hospital for extensive medical care, like surgery, this, that, and the other.
Including one British officer we're going to end up talking about. It becomes very important
Lippman
for
Castle.
this.
Yeah, Lippman Castle.
And the other one, the one that's much more famously depicted.
Yeah. Well, Lippman Castle, he's a surgeon. He is a South African surgeon of Jewish descent. He is Jewish, and he operates there. And together with an SS doctor, Skalka, he is the head doctor of the 9th SS Panzer Division, together with Dutch doctors, and they operate on anybody. There is a famous, going a little bit down that rabbit hole quickly, there is a famous confrontation, however, between Skalka and Lippman Castle. And what happens is that from the Oosterbeek perimeter, during the latter days of the fighting there, a person who's quite well known to Lippman Castle comes in. He wears a uniform of a corporal, but it's actually Brigadier John Hackett. And they put a different uniform on so that the Germans would know that he's actually a general. And but he has a heavy stomach wound, and Skalka, the Germans have a procedure that basically says, if you have a stomach wound or a headshot, we put you away with morphine, let you die. And this is also the order that he gives. Lippman Castle, however, he recognizes this is Hackett. And it's important to try to save them. And he thinks that he can, because he's a very gifted surgeon. And he pleads with Skalka, and they have quite a debate that he wants to have a try. And he actually operates on Hackett for about 2 hours and saves his life for the first time. They would meet later, not in Operation Pegasus, but post Pegasus. They would meet when they are escaping. We won't go into those escapes during this, how that all panned out.
Well, you have to give him a lot of credit too. That is when Shan Hackett shows up and he doesn't, drop the ball that it's who it is.
Yeah.
And then to knowingly continue to process this information and properly put it in the amount of effort in that he needs to do. So, a lot of kudos to him.
But Lippmann Castle, of course, knows that it will be a matter of time before the Germans realize who they actually have here. So he is in touch with some Dutch underground, and one of the Dutch undergrounds is actually working at the hospital from Ede, and that guy is called Blue Johnny, because he is always wearing blue coveralls. He's a 20-year-old boy or young man. And bearing in mind, I think, for all the listeners here, these Dutch underground are people with no military background, no military training, but though some have a little bit military background, but not those not those immediate operational players. No military training, no military background, no intelligence background or training. They make it up as they go along. So, and that's extremely risky and extremely difficult, and also, I think, extremely brave. And
without a doubt,
Blue Johnny had already been smuggling out a couple of dozen of British airborne troops out of the hospital, getting them in touch with the Ede underground so they could go in hiding. And they decide, together with the head of the Ede resistance, that Shan Hackett, as he's normally called, is to be abducted from that hospital and driven to Ede in a car in order to convalesce in a house there, which is, let's say, in a safe house there. And that's exactly what they do, much to the chagrin of Hackett, because he doesn't understand what's going on. So he starts to protest as they are trying to abduct him from the hospital. So, and he really doesn't, and I think also Hackett is also a little bit suspicious of what's going on until another brigadier comes in when he's in hiding in Ede, and that's Brigadier Lethbury, who is also famously depicted in A Bridge Too Far, because he is the general that got shot through the spine as they're running through the streets of Arnhem. With General Urquhart. And he ends up in that hospital, and when he gets a little bit better, he simply walks out on his own. And he's not the only one who walks out, because one guy who's also very heavily depicted in Band of Brothers, Lieutenant Colonel David Dobie.
Yep.
He is caught on the 19th of September 1944 near the hospital as they are trying to get through that spindle line we already mentioned. He gets captured. His entire battalion is completely disintegrated. I think he ends up with a battalion. He jumped with about 550 men. He ended up with just about 20 men in a room. That's all what were left of his battalion, just 20.
Yeah.
Within 2 days.
They were constantly, as they moved up the north side of Arnhem, they were constantly pinballing off of German units, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was trying to break through, take that swing around to get to the bridge, and he kept pinballing and getting whittled down the whole time.
Yeah. They were what you call surrounded from the north, the south.
Yeah.
And really.
And the west.
And the west.
Yeah, they closed up behind them in the west. Yeah.
And they were, even right up until Operation Berlin, that surrounding just was gradually crushing. It just got closer and closer and closer until they had no other option but to evacuate across the Rhine.
Mm-hmm. So coming back to Dobie is wounded. He gets brought to Elizabeth Hospital, where they treat him to his wound. Now, those are, let's say, relatively minor wounds, but he still needs medical treatment. So as he's being treated there, his German guard, let's say, liberates Dobie of his wristwatch. Mm-hmm. And starts to show that to a German nurse in the corridor, basically boasting what he just done, and that has now obtained his beautiful watch. As Dobie recognized that the German doesn't have much attention for him, and he simply thinks if you're not paying attention, I just walk. And he just walks out the front door, greets a German sentry at the front door of the sentry, and walks around the corner, hides in some bushes until the night, then goes across the road into another building, sleeps in a bed that happens to be a building of a local doctor who's in the cellar hiding from the fighting, and the local doctor then later finds him later that night and takes care of him and gets him in touch with the local resistance. And Dobie is also brought then via different stages also to Ede. So and that Ede resistance is really heavily involved and in organizing a lot of these things. And what you will see also, if you look at the places where a lot of these British paratroopers and also glider troops that are evading, are hiding, it's all around Ede, because that's literally the network that they have.
Mhm.
And the end of a couple of hundred people there. And as I already mentioned, the Germans know something is going on. It's just a matter of time before the Germans will get an inroad, and from there it's just basically pulling the thread, right, and just rolling everything up.
Yep. So it's about 3 weeks into October when Dobie makes his way across the river. Is that correct? About that time frame?
Yeah. But the way it happens is it's completely different than in the series.
Yeah.
Now, what actually happens is that whilst all this is going on, and Market Garden ended on the 26th, as we mentioned in the beginning, there is quite an illustrious figure arriving at Nijmegen. And that guy is an escape artist himself.
Mhm.
He was at Dunkirk in 1940, was captured by the Germans, sent to a PW camp in Germany, from which he escaped, got caught again. I think he tried to escape them from a different PW camp, ends up in the infamous Colditz Castle, from which there was no escape. However, this man called Harry Neve thinks, well, I'm having a go anyways. He uses a Polish uniform, changes it a little bit, dyes it a little bit, or paints it a little bit, and just starts walking past a German sentry, saluting him. And the German sentry at first lets him go, and then all of a sudden the German sentry picks up on it, and arrests him again right outside Colditz Castle. And stupidly enough, as Neve asked the German sentry what went wrong, the German says, well, the colors are not correct. Handing Harry Neve vital information to correct his mistakes, and having a second go a couple of weeks later with a Dutch officer. And they both get out of the Colditz Castle and via France and Spain. Within a couple of, in the course of about 3 months, he gets back to England. And of course, he's one of the first that successfully escapes and gets back to England. And he becomes very important and gets recruited by intelligence organizations called MI9.
Yep.
We all know MI6 from James Bond. MI9 was a highly secretive military intelligence bureau during the war, which, amongst other things, specialized in setting up escape lines and helping escapers and evaders. And this Harry Neve, fast forward a bit, in September 44, end of September 44, literally on the 26th, arrives in Nijmegen, because Market Garden also closed down a lot of pilot escape lines.
Mhm.
And he's there to try to reopen them. Now Market Garden has moved the front forward. And at Nijmegen, he gets in touch with the Nijmegen resistance, and they tell him about these people in Ede that they are in contact with, who are in the process of hiding hundreds of British soldiers behind enemy lines. And Harry Neve does have some experience with 2 previous mass escapes, so he starts to join in on that entire operation and takes control. Literally, he takes control over the entire thing that's going on. You talked about communications before. The way they communicate is using a secret telephone line, which literally is a telephone line between power stations in the Netherlands, which was completely separate, physically separate from the normal telephone lines. Now, the thing is that the Germans never knew that the Dutch had this, and
Yep.
Dutch underground network knew that the Germans weren't in on it. So the Germans could not eavesdrop on those telephone lines, and those telephone lines were used by a lot of Dutch resistance groups to do, let's say, bearing in mind we're a small country, long distance communications.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and Harry Neve is introduced via the telephone line, first of all, with the head of the Dutch resistance in Ede, and pretty soon with the British airborne officer, who, for security reasons, doesn't mention who he is, but he is referred to as the voice because he has got a very distinct voice. Harry Neve basically starts dealing with him, and throughout that process, Harry Neve says, the main thing is we're an intelligence organization. We don't have the means to set up. We know you have the experience, but we don't have the necessary people and equipment to set up, stage a mass escape. So what he needs is he needs to convince the higher ranks in the British Army to give him those resources.
Yeah, the things he needs to make this happen. Yeah.
Yes. And what he requests is that one of the officers is coming down to Nijmegen to help him make that request. And that officer is Lieutenant Colonel Doby, who just doesn't swim the Rhine. He goes across the Rhine in a rowing boat, but not into Allied territory, not into the territory where the 101 is, but further west, which is still occupied by the Germans, crosses that part of the island, and then crosses the next river where he gets in touch with Harry Neve, and together they go to see the highest ranking officer, the General Sir Miles Dempsey of the British Second Army, who listens to their story and immediately reacts with the words, "Get them out now," and basically gives them carte blanche to use whoever they need and whatever they need to get this organized. And that's literally how Operation Pegasus kicks off.
Yeah, and he's eventually brought to the 101st Airborne Division command post, where McAuliffe, of all people, tasks him down to the 506. And I was going through my paperwork and reading about some of the behind the scenes stuff that happened here, and apparently while they were in Alborn, Doby would come down and periodically visit with the 506, specifically the 2nd Battalion. So he was very familiar with Strayer and the 2nd Battalion of the 506. And essentially, McAuliffe tells Sink, execute this portion of it, our portion of it, and he orders Strayer to support it. So, and that's how it gets down to the 506th and to the 2nd Battalion. And eventually, because the area where they want to conduct the rescue is in Easy Company's sector on the line. And at the time, as many people know, by then Moose Heiliger is now in command of Easy Company. On the 9th of October, Dick Winters is elevated to the executive officer position in 2nd Battalion. Moose Heiliger is brought down and he's put in command of Easy Company. And as they begin to do their prep work, they are provided Royal Engineers provide the boats. They're collapsible boats. Everybody thinks they're rubber boats. They're not. They're collapsible boats with a Royal Engineer coxswain who will guide the boat and assist with the paddling in the direction of the boats. And the men are trained on it. Now, a lot of the guys that I either talked to or read their accounts of it, they talked about how many men in the company stuck to the hard and fast rule of never volunteer for anything. But when you look at the list of participating troopers, and I know a lot of people have seen this particular document here, if anybody can see that, the list of troopers on that document is incomplete. It's missing, I want to say 4, Don Malarkey, Rod Bain, Eddie Joint, and I think there's one more missing. But anyway, there's a smattering from each platoon. There's a selection of guys from each platoon. When I first started doing the research, I thought, well, it looks like it's mostly first and third platoon guys. But then when you start to put all the pieces together, you have Moose Heiliger in command, and you have Harry Welsh, one of the longest standing platoon leaders in Easy Company from first platoon. And then you have Ed Shames, who has recently joined the company as an assistant platoon.
We've lost sound.
Sorry, Joe, can you hear us? Because the sound on your side is gone.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
When do we cut off?
You were talking about Shames recently taking over.
Yeah, so Ed Shames had recently joined the company as assistant platoon leader in third platoon. My friend Ian Gardner had written about Pegasus in one of his books, but he had relied on a trooper who was less than forthcoming and liked to elevate his own role in things. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation in that account. But in this regard, we can set a lot of this straight. But now that we've kind of talked about some of the Easy Company components to this, I want to flip it back to you so we can start talking about how the group coalesces, the rescuees start to coalesce before the rescue takes place. Can we do that?
I'll talk a little bit about it, because touching on, going back on what Ed said about the resistance as well. Not only do these people have to be hidden, they have to be given new identities, they have to be given civilian clothes, they have to have papers, they have to have their photographs taken. And also, what some of your listeners might or might not know is that there was I think the Netherlands had the highest percentage-wise collaboration rate. So you had to be so careful about who you could trust and who you couldn't trust. Yeah, all these men were given photographs taken, were given different identities, given new papers, given civilian clothes. And people like Tatum Walter and Tony Hibbert had to make sure that all the people that needed to know were in the know, and had to sort of like literally ride around the area of Ada, that area that was still under occupation, in order that everybody could know what was going on. And there's some fantastic stories. And I think both of them, Tony Hibbert and Digby Tatum Water, are larger than life characters. They're characters
Without a doubt.
straight out of a Boys Own magazine, you know, those hero comics that I did read some of them, but you guys will be more familiar with. And Tony Hibbert, I think, used to ride round on a bike with a ridiculous pair of socks on, didn't he, or something like that?
And I think he had yellow socks on. He had a
pair of golfing trousers or something.
Golfing trousers, and then a completely different color type of jacket on. He was so out of sync with anybody, that even Tatum Water, who you know was very brave and did high risk himself, and Joe will tell you a story, I think, about what Tatum Water did, and you were baffled about it. But even Tatum Water felt that Tony Hibbert was pushing his luck a little bit too much. But these men just did.
When you think about it, I mean, when you're in that situation, and having done some escape and evasion stuff myself in my own time in the service, not during wartime, all training, but the idea is to blend in and be innocuous and do not skyline yourself, right? It's just to blend in. And yeah, exactly. He's definitely pushing his luck. I'm surprised he didn't still have his top hat on, you know.
Tell them the Tatum Water story.
A lot of them as well were the other big problem they've got as well, for a lot of these men who were being hidden or had to be out in the area at certain times. You could only be out in certain times because the Germans imposed a curfew, etc., etc. Was the language difficulty. I mean, you have to speak either fluent Dutch or fluent German. And so a lot of these men were given a badge that denoted that they were deaf mutes. Okay, there must have been a huge percentage of deaf mutes swanning
Yeah.
around
That's one about
Ada in the month of October 1944. But Tatham Water, I mean, he is a real larger than life character. Just to give you a little bit about his background, when he first joined the army, he wanted to join the Indian army so he could hunt tigers. Okay, so that's a start. Then when he goes, his brother was killed in North Africa, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But his brother, he comes from this family that his brother was a tanky, and because he couldn't see, I think the story is he couldn't see properly out of the cupola of his tank, that he gets a chair, like a normal chair, and straps it to the top of his tank so he can see where he's going, and commands his tank from this chair. Tatham Water's sister, she gets involved with a medical unit that eventually gets attached to the French, and they get high on it. So he comes from this family that is, fairly robust. He joins the air when his brother gets killed. He joins the airborne. And even stories about him in the airborne, having mess fights and stuff like that. He's a larger than life character. He commandeers a plane, doesn't he? He flies a plane. This is before Market Garden.
Back in England.
Back in England, so he can fly his officers into London to have dinner at the Ritz. He's that sort of character. He's the man with the umbrella at the bridge. And one of the things he says at the bridge is obviously when they're fighting at the bridge, there's the west side and the east side, and the Germans are encroaching on them, continually shelling on the bridge. And the Padre, who is ensconced with the 1st Airborne, or predominantly 2nd Parachute Battalion, although a number of different 1st Airborne troops, has to get from one side of the bridge to the other, one of the houses to the other, because he wants to make sure the moral comfort of his men. But the Germans are shelling this bridge, whereupon Tatham Water said something to him like, "Don't worry, Padre, I'll take you across, I've got an umbrella," as if that's going to be protecting him whilst the Germans are shelling. He's that kind of character. Anyway,
Yeah.
fast forward
Eccentric is the word, I
fast
think.
forward to him
Yeah.
being in hiding in Ada. He's put in a building that is also occupied by German SS. Okay, so he's in the same building, but he's got this deaf mute badge. So obviously they think he's just a local deaf mute Dutch guy.
And this is, by the way, the house of the head of the Dutch resistance in Ede,
Yeah.
where these Germans are and where also
So
Tatham Water is.
So it's almost like a double bluff. If I house Germans in my house, they're never going to think A, that I have got anything to do with the resistance, or B, that I'm actually hiding a British paratrooper.
In plain sight.
But Tatham Water, because he's kind of heading up this, what will become the escape committee in Ada, he has to be out during the times when he can be out on a bike, so he can inform all the other people of what's going on. So he's going in and out of the house at roughly the same time. Oh,
And you saw the screen
he's
showing that.
at roughly the same time as the Germans are coming in and out, because they have to be in by a certain time of night because of curfew. And there becomes this kind of standoff at the front door where the Germans are trying to get in first, and Tatham Water's trying to get in first. And initially he stands back, but being the character he is, one evening he sort of thinks, right, I'm not having this, and he barges his way in front of the Germans, at which point one of the Germans laughs and pats him on the back, and they carry on living in this house alongside of, this is him that you see, they carry on living in the house alongside of each other until eventually Tatham Water, as part of Operation Pegasus, escapes. But he is the one that also every night he has to, or at a certain time of the day, he has to go to the power station in Ede to get on the telephone to speak to Erin Neve.
Yep.
And he is the main connection, but he's just such a wonderful character.
Yeah, he is the voice.
Yeah, he's the voice.
Yeah.
He eventually, after the war, he goes to live in South Africa. And there's a great book that's written about him, but he's the sort of person that is just a complete, he's a boy's own story on his own.
He looks like
Yeah.
he just it screams devil may care.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
just looks like I'm not. I'm a member of the British Army, and we're very much in our rules and regulations. But I am my own man, and I'm gonna do the things I want to do.
Yeah.
It
A bit
just
of
screams attitude there.
a bit of an eccentric, but we were talking about this earlier on today when we were talking about coming on the podcast here, and we were sort of saying, you know, he's the sort of person that if you were a soldier and you've been in the services, Joe, I've been a reservist soldier, that you almost feel like you would want to follow him, or you would want to work
Or
with him.
definitely serve with them in some capacity.
Yeah.
He'd definitely be a character, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Most
I wanted to go back. This is Ari Neve that you were talking about. Yep.
Yeah. No, definitely. And the other man that we also saw, that's Dirk Wildeboer. He's the head of the Ida Resistance. So that's the man in whose house the Germans are billeted, and also Tater Water stays. And Tony Hibbert is right next door. He's in the house next. So it's and
I knew I had these photos on. I wanted to bring them up. So for folks that are watching on YouTube, you get to see the men that Joe and Edwin are referring to. And I thought it'd be nice to share those as well. But I'm going to stop the share now so we can go back to our screen. Let's see what
Dirk
else we
Wildeboer
have.
has his run-in with the Germans, by the way, as well, because at some point the Germans find it a little bit odd that so many people go in and out of his house constantly. And it's not just British, unknown to the Germans, of course, but also Dutch people from the underground. And so they start querying Dirk Wildeboer. That's a bit odd. There's a lot of people coming into your house, and Dirk Wildeboer basically said, "Well, I'm from a committee organizing where the evacuees from Arnhem need to go, which is also happening around that time, right? And he uses that as an excuse that he says, and that's why certain people need to come in and out continuously, because we're trying to sort it out where to put all these civilians."
Right. And then as we get closer to the rescue itself, it must look like ants marching, right? As they collect them and bring them together and start to bring them down to the point, the rescue point.
And that's really the thing. So, and what happens initially is that Ari Neve has the idea that to get everybody out via a new escape line, pilot escape line, he dubs Windmill. Very nice name in the Netherlands, of course, a windmill line. And actually the first guy to go across it, or one of the first guys that go across it south, it's actually Dobie. He actually uses the windmill line. Now, in order to run that windmill line, Ari Neve dispatches two people near the town of Tiel, just a little bit north of the town of Tiel, northeast of the town of Tiel, at let's say a halfway house. That's a British officer called Ted Baker, wasn't it?
Peter Barker.
Peter Baker, and an American paratroop of the 82nd Airborne Division, and you undoubtedly have heard about him, Ted Buckenheimer, the very infamous guy from the 504.
Yeah.
Right, so and they are sent there to coordinate things. Ted Buckenheimer has attached himself to MI9. I don't know how, but he apparently the character that he is. I think for those of the listeners who don't know Ted Buckenheimer and the backstory of him, I would just say Ted Buckenheimer was kind of a maverick, kind of the guy who fought, even though he fought in the 504. And he jumped with the 504 near Nijmegen. He fought his own war. Undoubtedly a very brave young man. I think he was 21 years old, but also a high risk taker.
Well, I think Peter Baker was as well.
And Peter Baker as well, yeah. So, and what actually happens is that Ari Neve dispatches them there to that farmhouse outside Tiel, that halfway house, a vital point collection and let's say through point and of that escape line, and he orders them to do two things. One is do not get out of your uniform. Secondly, do not get out of the house and start walking around. You need to be there in full secrecy.
Yeah.
And they both disregard, they disregard both orders. Once they are there, they think, okay, this is a nice neighborhood, nice rural area with
I'm
a
just
nice
gonna walk
village.
around here.
And we're going to walk around here in this very tiny village outside Thiel, where everybody knows everybody,
Everybody else, yeah.
in civilian clothes. And sure enough, a Dutch Nazi collaborator picks up on them. And whether he picked up also on sound, hearing them talk, I don't know. But the Dutch Nazi collaborator, however, follows them. And long story short, within soon, the Germans raid the farm, taking prisoner the British officer Baker and Peter Baker and Ted Buckenheimer. The farmer is taken away by the Gestapo, faces torture for the next couple of days, and is being executed. His wife and his kids are being chased out of the house, and the entire farmhouse is burned to the ground.
All because those two couldn't follow orders.
Compromising the entire operation.
Network, yeah, everything.
Yeah, compromising the entire operation.
Not only does it compromise the windmill line, but it also compromises Pegasus as well.
Yep.
And Harry Neve is furious about it.
Yeah. So he knows that time is running
About
out.
what time frame, what day does this happen in
This would have
October?
been about mid-October,
Yeah.
shortly after.
Okay.
So Dobie gets to Nijmegen around the 16th, or he starts to leave the area on the 16th of October. It takes him a couple of days to get there. So let's say around between the 16th and the 20th. The dates are a little bit vague on it sometimes,
But now on the
around that time.
on the U.S. side, at this point, they're well aware that the rescue is going to go down. McAuliffe essentially tells Sink, whatever you need to support from our end, you'll get. Sink intelligently figures out he needs to desensitize the Germans on the other side of the Rhine, and he decides to request anti-aircraft gun support. And the call goes out through the 81st Anti-Tank Anti-Aircraft Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Cox, to supply a Bofors battery. And about that time, I want to say probably on the 18th or 19th, they begin hour by hour firing of this gun at the German positions to desensitize them. And then also, when you think about it, intelligently, the noise from the gun and the impact will also shield the sound of the rescue going off. So very smart way to do business here. They desensitize the Germans to the firing. The remainder of the easy troops that are not part of the rescue force are brought up on the line. And I've talked about this quite a bit on my tours when we go up to the Crossroads positions and we talk about how the German force got through the lines is because they didn't have enough troops, the Easy Company and the other companies of the 506, to man a continuous line. So what they had to do was outpost it and then conduct roving patrols between the outposts. And you never want to set a pattern for the enemy. So these patrols after dark, because the Germans are higher elevation, they can see into the Allied lines and they can shell them at will. So they become very nocturnal, and these patrols are occurring between them. But I remember talking to Babe Heffron about it, and he said, yeah, they had me move my machine gun up to a position on the dike to be prepared to cover the rescue force coming back. So Easy Company, the troopers that are not part of the rescue force, are placed on outpost in positions to provide supporting fire. And we're going to take a quick break here. So if everybody bears with us, I'll be back in a few minutes. And welcome back, everyone, to the tail end of episode 26, where we're discussing Operation Pegasus with Joe Hook and Edwin Popken. I think that when people who watch Band of Brothers look at the rescue itself, it seems like it's almost very slapdash in the way it was put together. And I think the folks that have been listening along to this point understand how amazingly complex and difficult it was for them to assemble this, both sides of it. Obviously, for the 101st, it's a little less difficult. I mean, because they're already in position. All they have to do is move around. Essentially, I hate to make it sound very flippant, but they just move a few chess pieces around on the board. Whereas on the Dutch side and the British airborne side, it's amazingly complex how this all has to come together, and it's like a symphony. If one thing's off, it just could go to hell. And I think it's fairly amazing that it was able to come off in the manner it does. I did share. I had this screen up when we first when I started off the second half here, and this is a good look at one of the engineer boats. And I don't know if folks can take a look and see just how flimsy these boats were. I mean, they were canvas sides with wooden struts and a basically a wooden floorboard to it. It wasn't like there was any protection in these boats that are provided to Easy Company to conduct the rescue. And I did want to go over some of the men who take part and are important parts of this. Obviously, you have Robert Sink and on the left, and Bob Strayer in the middle, and then Dave Dobie on the right. From the company headquarters, or for the platoon leaders and the officers involved in this, Moose Heiliger on the left, Harry Welsh in the center, and Ed Shames on the right. And as we talked about prior to, we had the troopers came from all across the Easy Company's platoons. On the left, you have Charlie Reinhardt, who had originally started in 2nd Battalion headquarters in the Communications Center section. Yes.
Joe, sorry to interrupt, but I don't know. I'm still seeing the boat with the British soldier.
Okay, I need to change this around then. So let's stop the sharing with that.
I don't know. I don't know if that also would affect the anybody who's also watching. And
how's that?
Here we are.
Okay. All right. So again, on the left, Sink, in the center, Strayer, and then Dobie on the right. The officers that were involved on the Easy Company side, Moose Heiliger on the left, Harry Welsh in the center, and Ed Shames on the right. And like I said, we talked about how the members of this rescue force come from across the company. On the left, Charlie Reinhardt. He originally started in 2nd Battalion headquarters in the communications section, and he ends up joining Easy Company on D-Day, and he remains with them through the end of the war. On the right, Jack McGrath, who is famously depicted in Band of Brothers. You're going to get me killed, Lieutenant. From 1st Platoon, you have Ralph Stafford on the left, and Ralph Stafford ends up becoming like the lead scout as they make landfall on the north side of the Rhine. John Lynch, who's he's actually in 2nd Platoon in the mortar section. And on the right, Les Hashy on the right with his good friend Tony Garcia, and Les wrote quite a bit about the rescue itself in his own notes. From 2nd Platoon, Don Malarkey on the left, and Rod Bain and Eddie Joint going left to right. Ed Mauser and Herman Hack Hansen. And from 3rd Platoon, in the center of that group photo, says Paul Rogers on the left, Walter Hendricks next in line on the left side. Walter commanded one of the machine gun sections supporting the rescue. And on the right-hand picture, the gentleman behind the machine gun, Walter Gordon, who commands with Francis Mellett the machine gun on the left side of the perimeter when they go in. And then finally, Frankie Mellett on the left with Forrest Guth on D-Day morning. Popeye Wynn and Wayne Skinny Sisk. Unfortunately, I didn't have photos for Gerald Fleury, James McMahon, or Siles Harrelson, but I thought it'd be interesting for folks to see the actual faces of the men that took part of it in the rescue on Easy Company's side. But back to you guys, the coalescing of the groups, right? They have to make their way to a central point before they can affect the rescue. And again, that 40mm Bofors is firing basically on the hour, every hour since somewhere around the 18th, 19th, 20th time frame, to desensitize the Germans to this. And according to the men of Easy Company, they actually had time to practice with the boats. They do practice with them. the toughest part, according to a lot of the men, was the synchronizing of the paddle work, and also conducting the strokes without slapping the paddles on the water so it would create a sound that the Germans could hear. So they had to do a lot of work, and having spent time on small boats during my time in service, it is not easy to synchronize if you've got a team that has never done it before. It takes quite a bit of practice before you can get that level of rhythm, and the coxswain is very important to that. And the English had supplied Royal Engineer coxswains to go with the boats, as we talked about. But anyway, back to you guys with the coalescing of the elements to get them down together to the rescue point. How difficult is that for them to do?
Before we get into that,
Mhm.
I do want to point out it's not just British Royal Engineers that are involved in it.
Is it Canadians as well?
And interestingly, and that's also why I want to mention, also because I think, I want to point out for everybody who's listening and watching, this is really an allied effort. That's first. Secondly, also, the Canadians play an important part because it's the Canadian Engineer Unit, Royal Canadian Engineer Unit, that plays part in Operation Pegasus, was also involved several weeks before in Operation Berlin, which is the withdrawal of the remnants of British Airborne Division at Oosterbeek, a couple of miles upstream. Right, so you've got a Canadian unit here also that is a little bit acquainted with the river, which I think is an important factor.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't get a chance to quote unquote sail on a body of water, and it's very unfamiliar to you, it's definitely going to impact how you do what you have to do. In this case, paddle across and paddle back, and that familiarity probably aids in the expeditiousness of the rescue. I do want to point out, though, and a lot of people have asked this in the past, was how come this guy wasn't involved? It's a little glary. How come he wasn't involved in the planning of the?
Winters?
Yeah, or with Harry Welsh. How come he wasn't involved in it? Considering his tactical acumen, why wasn't he involved in the planning? And I think, and this is my personal observation, was he was still learning his role as the executive officer, and he's being tasked to do things that supersede him having to, and he's not an operations officer at that point. The battalion has its own operations cell, and they're the ones that are in charge of coordinating with Heiliger as he works through the tactical level plan. But we always get asked, like, why wasn't Winters? He was so good in the field and commanding troops and how to tactically employ troops. Why wasn't he involved? Well, he's not an operations officer. He's this executive officer. He's the second in command. He has a host of duties that preclude him from taking part in the planning and execution of the operation. And I think they allude to it in Band. You don't really get a clean look at why he's not involved, except for there's one throwaway line, I think, between him and Moose, or him and Nixon, where he's like, I don't know what you guys are doing, kind of thing. It's very interesting. And like I said, I always get asked that, why wasn't he involved? And that's why he had his other duties to perform. But anyway, and we talked about it, and I try to prompt you. Let's talk about that coalescing and getting the rescuees down to where they need to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I'll start,
Yeah,
and then,
you start.
Ed can carry on. The one big thing they have in their favour, you've got to corral all these different people together from all different parts, even though they're in quite a small area, they still have to be corralled together. The big thing that they have in their favour is that when all these men are coming together, the Germans order an evacuation of the area. So as well as you've got these airborne men in all their different forms of dress and their civilian dress, they are being evacuated. They're being corralled together, or they're being taken down to a central collection point, shall we call it, at the same time that civilians are being evacuated from that part of the Netherlands. And so there are so many people on the roads in whatever manner of transport. So another guy I knew was Tom Bowden. Now, he was looked after by a woman called Miss Lambert, and there was a number of them, and she had a pony and cart. And so she's evacuated. And so they travel with her on this pony and cart. And the Germans just don't have enough men in the area to stop everybody and check your papers, check your ID, check who you are, because there's a mass evacuation taking place. So that works very much in their favour. The other thing that once they come to the collection point, and Ed will carry on with this, is that once there, these men who are dressed in civilian clothes don't have to change back into uniform. They have to be given weapons, and all that is done by the resistance. So where we talked about the hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, what's not widely known is the morgue in the hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital, was used by the resistance for the collection of weapons that would later on be used and given to the airborne men once they had to revert back into uniform. So the big thing that was working in their favour was the evacuation of that part of the Netherlands as well, because they could sort of like morph along into the these people being evacuated.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier because you don't have the strong German presence there. You can start moving people a little bit more in the open, but not, again, you talked about the collaboration levels. You still have to be very guarded in getting them where they need to be.
Yeah, but I'm glad we brought up weapons and uniforms, because if you just think about it, a lot of these men, you know, they have been in, if they're still wearing their own, initially as they escape and evade, they're wearing their own uniform, right? But there will be blood on it. Sometimes it might be torn, it will be dirty, this, that, and the other. So effectively, a lot of these uniforms can't be used anymore. Right, and especially if you go into hiding, you know, you want to get rid of that stuff, because if you get caught and there is a British uniform there, you know, things can go pretty bad. So there's different reasons for why a lot of those uniforms are done away with, or they're not complete anymore for whatever reason, right? So and I at this stage I have to complicate things a little bit, because initially the idea that let's say the leadership of the British Airborne Division still in hiding, so we're talking about the Brigadiers Lethbury and Hackett, who are very heavily involved in the planning, but more in the background. Lethbury would be in Operation Pegasus. Hackett would not get out until late January 1945, because he's still convalescing from his wounds. He's the guy that was abducted from the hospital. But them, including Dobie and Tatum Water, they have the idea initially that they will stay north of the Rhine doing, you know, let's say sabotage kind of things, and be a force already behind enemy lines, that as soon as the British Army comes across the river, that they can, you know, do all sorts of operations, and they're airborne, right? So to them, it's quite logical.
Yeah, they're used to that mentality of being surrounded and conducting operations.
And they're already there, right? So behind enemy lines. So they come up with all sorts of plans. And in order to do that, they need to be re-equipped with new uniforms, you know, new helmets, this, that, and the other, weapons, munitions, explosive, the lot.
You really have to admire their dedication to the mission when you know, it's very, to have that mentality where you have the ability to be rescued, come back into the Allied lines, and then be re-equipped and be fed back into your unit to help build it up again. And then to it's like a 180. I mean, where you decide, you know what, I'm in peril here, but I don't care. I believe in the mission. All you got to do is just drop me some supplies so I can, you know, get on with it. I mean, that is an amazing way to think and I think as a former service member, you know, how would I process that? And I probably would want to go back to my lines and get back with my unit and get going again. But that's, you know, like you said, that airborne mentality of, you know, I'm used to this idea of being surrounded, conducting operations and scene setting operations where you're conducting sabotage operations to further and advance into the land where you're at. I mean, that's just an amazing amount of dedication on the part of those officers.
Yeah. And also the human aspect of it is some of these men were family men. Some of them were married. You know, you have no idea what your wife at home, whether she knows if you're alive and dead, or whether she's been told you're taken into a prison camp, what they so there is that human aspect that I can't remember. I think it was Graham Warwick who was also one of the escapees, but it was in his book he mentions about
He's the divisional surgeon.
he's the divisional surgeon. What would my wife be thinking and stuff like that? And I think, don't quote me on this, I think he manages to get a message through to his wife to say, I'm alive and well, I'm okay. But yeah, those that remain behind, you're unaware of, you know, the thoughts that must be going through the people at home and not knowing.
Yeah, that unknown, which doesn't exist this day because the global communications has done away with that. And I remember my first trip to Iraq in 2003, we did not have that kind of global communications available to the front line guys. And we communicated the old fashioned way. We wrote letters back and forth. And then when I went back again in 2007, I could literally message my wife, either call her that day or I could message her like right away. I mean, again, I fully understand that whole the time lapse that happens when you're only communicating by written or maybe a phone call every once in a while. And what the unknown does to the family back home too.
And with it, like Joe said, within this context, you know, different people make different decisions. There's one guy in the 1st British Airborne Division who would become, he would become legendary in the British Airborne Forces. And that guy's called Sergeant Tex Benwell. And Tex Benwell, actually, he escaped from a train that's going to Germany as PW, together with somebody, some other people, one of them who will escape via the windmill line as well, a Canadian loan officer, as they call them, Leo Heaps, who would be involved also in Operation Pegasus on the American side with Erin Eve and some of the others on the part of the, but he is actually British 1st Airborne himself. But Tex Benwell decides, well, Leo Heaps and glider pilot go south via then still windmill. He decides, no, I'm going to stay with the Dutch underground, because he saw that the Dutch underground have been delivered a stack of weapons, one of which is a Bren gun.
And he's a weapons instructor.
And he's a weapons instructor. And the Dutch underground doesn't know what to do with that kind of weapon. So he decides, oh, I'll stay. And he becomes a weapons instructor for the Dutch underground, not in Ede, a little bit further north near town, a little bit more in the rural countryside. And he gets involved in an ambush near a town called Putten. And those of your listeners that might be Dutch, that will have a distinctive sound to it, because that ambush in which he is involved, Tex Benwell, that leads to a repercussion of by the Nazis, which leads to hundreds of men, I think over 500 men of Putten, being taken away to Germany, and less than 100 come back after the war. But Tex Benwell remains behind enemy lines, doing all sorts of things for the resistance, until he gets captured himself. And I think he ends up somewhere in a camp near Auschwitz, doesn't he?
He ends up in Auschwitz.
He ends up in Auschwitz, actually. And but after all, he comes back, stays in the army, and I think by the end of his career in the parachute regiment, he has done no less than 500 jumps.
Jim, wow.
Including practice jumps, right? But this guy must have been one of the most experienced paratroopers, I think, around the world.
Wow, the wear and tear on your body at 500 jumps, I could only imagine with man, he must have been beat up pretty good.
Yeah, but he's something else. If you read his full biography, that guy is also, you know, we use the term several times, larger than life, but I think it would be a fitting.
And also a bit of a lunatic.
Yeah.
500 jumps, I would say that's probably accurate.
Yeah, but going back to that entire stuff of weapons, munitions, this, that, and the other. Now, how to get it? Now, here it comes in a Belgian officer. It's very international, all of it.
Yeah.
Called Gilbert Sadi Kirschen. He's a 20-year-old guy, and he is known as Captain King behind enemy lines, or Fabian, and he is actually an SAS operative
Mhm.
working with special executive with the SOE, special operations executive behind enemy lines to do all sorts of coordination with the Dutch underground. And he has a radio and he gets all that material in. And it's eventually that all that material, new uniforms, weapons, munitions, this, that, and the other, that they also use partly for to equip and kit out the guys that will be in eventually in Operation Pegasus. And all that stuff has to be moved forward to a secret stashing place, which is a very small barn, couple of hundred, about a mile, I think, north of the Rhine.
Yeah, it's still there today.
It's still there. That barn is still there today. And we take people there sometimes.
Amazing.
But the escapees don't go to that barn directly. They go to a place still a mile further north. So about between 2 to 3 miles north of the Rhine, in some woods where they are throughout the day of the 22nd, they are brought in piecemeal.
Yeah, of course.
On bike, but they even use lorries to get these guys in bigger batches. Driving through the countryside, as Joe said, the Germans don't really check on people because there's an evacuation taking.
Yeah, they're being withdrawn. Yeah,
because the Germans have decided that anywhere up to 3 miles from the river will be military zone. All the civilians have to evacuate, and that's the chaos that they use to cover the displacement of all these airborne troops.
hiding in the noise. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they do.
So they finally get to they get them down there towards the evac, and this is the evening of the 22nd. They finally have them staged and ready.
Yeah.
Yep. From Easy Company's side, it takes several trips with the boats to get everybody back, but they take a single echelon of boats across. Now, when they get to the opposite side of the river, they immediately fan out in a crescent-shaped perimeter, with Moose Heiliger at the center point, and Ralph Stafford takes lead scout. And by his own admission, as he got up closer to the tree line, or the line of bushes that bordered the edge of the ground as they moved up, a bird took off out of the bushes, and he actually shot a few rounds from his Thompson because he was scared and he didn't realize it. And he thought, oh man, I've just ruined this whole thing. And Moose came up and he basically said, what did you see? And he said, I didn't see anything. He admitted he saw a bird scared the crap out of him, and he fired a couple of rounds into the ground. And he goes, okay, I hope he didn't hit anybody we're trying to rescue. And then they begin to fan out. Now, Harry Welsh takes the left side of the crescent from Moose. If you're looking at it as a clock face, Moose is at the 12 o'clock position. Harry Welsh is at the 9 o'clock position with his machine gun team, which is Walter Gordon and Frankie Mellett. Shames takes the 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock portion of the perimeter with Walter Hendricks's machine gun team anchoring that side of the perimeter, and then they wait. And I'll let you describe it from their point of view, but from the Easy guys' points of view, as the British were coming through, they remarked about how noisy they were. A lot of them were saying, God bless you, Yank, or I've never been so glad to see a Yank before in my entire life. A number of them gave their airborne berets to the men of Easy Company. And then Don Malarkey did tell me, even when they were paddling across, the Brits were jabbering away, and he had to several times turn around and tell them to be quiet. And it took several trips to get everybody back across the river. But they finally leave the boats at the river's edge, and in the morning the Germans spot them and they shell them and they blow the boats to hell. But I know I gave it from the Easy Company point of view, but I want to give you guys the chance to talk about it from the Allied point of view on the north side.
Yeah, so just taking it back to let's say the afternoon of the 22nd, as they are gathering in those forests and awaiting and they're still in civilian clothes back then.
Mhm.
awaiting nightfall, and they do not move out until 9 p.m. And what happens then is that because they are still so far from the river, it's German infested area. The Dutch underground actually guides them through the woods. And again, we know the route that they took. It's been quite well documented. And we sometimes also take people on that exact same route through the forest until they get to that barn. Again, about a mile from the river. Now, at that barn, they start getting rid of their civilian clothes, getting dressed in the military uniforms, get their weapons, this, that, and the other. And at that point, they technically say goodbye to the Dutch resistance, even though some of the Dutch resistance will accompany them, because of the 138 people that will get across that night, 8 of them are Dutch civilians,
Yep.
resistance workers on the run from the Gestapo. They need to get out as well. Majority is British 1st Airborne, but there are also some British and American
Aviators, yeah.
aviators that were downed in there. And it's funny that you should say about the, let's say, the lack of noise discipline there, because I think it's Tatum Water who complained that during their walk through the woods, which was pitch dark, there's no moon, they don't know the route, so they basically hang on to each other's shoulder or to each other's jacket, and
They were like a herd of elephants, didn't they?
and Tatum Water, and he didn't have that much trouble with his own men, but mostly with the civilians and the aircrew who are not trained militarily, not infantry trained. So
Interesting, they used the same technique for Operation Berlin when they were going down to the riverside to the boats.
Yeah,
They
it's very simple
holding on to the kid of the man in front of you.
Yeah.
It's a very simple technique, but without, let's say, night vision goggles, what do you do? Right? So it seems logical to me. Anyways, from the time that they part from the Dutch underground at that barn, it's basically it's conducted like a military operation. And a couple of nights before, I think it was 2 British airborne troops, Company Sergeant Major, I think it was CSM Wainwright, was involved in that. They already scouted the route, so they actually know that where they are going. But from that moment, it's a military operation, technically led by none other than Digby Tatum Water himself and
Lieutenant Colonel
Tony Hibbert.
Tony Hibbert.
Joe's friend, who technically takes over and leads them towards the Dyke Road on the northern side of the river, where they get in between German sentry posts, who also patrol that area, just like the Americans do on their side.
Yep.
But the pre-escape recce already established that the Germans, interestingly, contrary to what you said, how easy company guys did it, just being just trying to be, not to be, do everything at the same time, just vary it. And the Germans were like clockwork.
Setting a pattern.
Setting a pattern.
Yeah.
And so
It allows you to work around the pattern then.
And using that also to get these guys across that main Dyke Road and down a small road towards the embankment, which road also still exists, and then going the latter part, they're going diagonally across the field towards what they dubbed Point Digby in honor of Digby Tatum Water.
Yeah.
That was actually the code word for it, Point Digby.
And I think the British maps, the hand-drawn maps, actually annotate Point Digby on there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they do. But they make a mistake because it's pitch dark. There's no moon. There's a lot of noise, of course, because you said the artillery and the anti-aircraft guns are firing, and just to keep the Germans also, looking the other way. They actually encounter a German patrol. There is some firing, but the Germans quickly withdraw, and that's possibly done because the Americans, prior to this operation, have patrolled that area north of the Rhine also quite vigorously, basically signaling to the Germans, don't patrol here too often because we will come at you.
Yeah.
And that keeps the Germans at bay a little bit there. But actually, Tatum Waters sends out a red flashlight, as you would say, a torch, as the Brits would say, real victory sign, which is a little bit offset. It's not as Point Digby. It's about half a mile further to the east. So initially, if you read the account by, let's say, Harry Neve, he's at that, what used to be that orchard on the southern side. He's not on the north bank. He didn't go with the Easter Company. He's, let's say, the reception committee on the other side of the river. And they can't see that signal, that V.
They can't see the torch,
until I think it was one of the other MI9 officers there, Hugh Fraser, who looks a little bit to the right, and all of a sudden they spot it. And well, long story short, they make Leo Heaps, the Canadian Canloan officer, who's now also working with Harry Neve. He's also on the north side of the river, together with Dobie, and him and Dobie are going then eastwards to try to contact Tatum Water. Tatum Water, if you read his accounts, he is explaining that he's wondering where the Americans are and where they because he's on the wrong place technically.
Yeah, they missed the extraction
until he
point.
realizes it might be a little bit further, so he starts moving forward. Until all of a sudden he hears a Canadian voice asking him, "Are you guys by any chance looking for a boat?" And Tatum Waters' immediate reply is, "I think we are rather." And that's actually how they meet up. It's too
like
silly.
you said, this needs a movie on its own.
But this is according to Tatum Water in his debrief what happened. So and they start extricating these people. One of the first guys to get across is Brigadier General Lethbury, and meeting also up with Harry Neve, and Harry Neve stays at the southern side of the river until the last guys get across. And the last guy to get out of the boat, last British airborne trooper that gets out of the boat and approaches him, comes at him, starts talking to him, that he's the last one, and Harry Neve recognizes who he's talking to, because that's the guy he's been talking to.
The voice.
On the voice, that's Tatum Water. Tatum Water is actually the last guy out.
And ironically, Tony Hibbert comes out, gets to the southern side of the Rhine, and when they're all being taken to Nijmegen, because I think they're all taken to Nijmegen and processed before they fly.
From Eindhoven.
From Eindhoven, which is where Ed lives in the Netherlands. But Tony Hibbert, once he gets back on the south side of the Rhine, I think he's actually sitting on the front of a Jeep that gets involved in quite a bad accident and breaks both his legs. So to go through all that,
and then have your legs broken in a traffic accident. Yeah, the other thing is, in the miniseries they show them having this little party at the end. This is rubbish. I talked to several of the guys. They're like, no, they whisked these guys away, and we went right back on the line and doing what we were doing. I think at the time first platoon was in reserve, and it was second and third who were manning parts of the line, and they're like, no, there was no drinking, no partying, none of that. These guys got whisked away. We never saw them. I think they stopped at the division clearing station for processing really quick, make sure nobody had any life-threatening injuries, and then they were gone.
Debriefed.
Yeah, and there was according to the Brits, there was also a small first aid station in Randwijk, where they were initially taken in. They got hot coffee, got a blanket, and medics looked at their wounds because some of these people had been traveling while still wounded. So fire divisional station, and then
there's some great photos of some of the rescued Red Devils, but they're not from Pegasus. They're from they were from Berlin. Yeah, but it's interesting to see them because it does give you a good idea of how bedraggled these guys were, how beat up they were, and then a lot of them are wearing blankets over their shoulders because some of them lost clothing coming across, or they were wounded and they had their clothing cut off of them to be treated. and you know, some of these guys are in their, you know, in their drawers, you know, they're in their underwear.
And certainly after Berlin, and a lot of people get confused with Berlin and Pegasus, and you have to be quite clear about what you're talking about. But with Berlin, all of those that come across after the evacuation, after Market Garden finally comes to an end, you know, had been previously fighting since they dropped, since the 17th or 18th, or for the Poles, the 21st, those Poles that got in the perimeter. So their uniform would have been in shreds, and a fair amount of them would have been, you know, bearded, thin,
Emaciated. Yeah.
yeah, emaciated because of the lack of food, tired and looking bedraggled. Whereas for Pegasus, slightly different because they had new uniforms and they were in better shape.
Yep. And but so this has been a tour de force so far. So we're rapidly approaching our second hour, the end of our second hour. But I know you wanted to talk about after Pegasus and then some of the rescues that happened after that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sweet and short a little bit about that. There is an Operation Pegasus 2. Pegasus 1 was such a massive success. Still to this date, it's the largest successful mass escape in northwestern Europe
In the
in the Second World War.
Yeah.
It's really it's legendary.
And they did it right under the nose of the German army, which is amazing.
It's amazing, and if you see how many people were involved in it, you know, it's an inter-allied, truly inter-allied operation, and everybody was heavily needed. It's a textbook example, I would say, of how
and you know that
allied forces join together and pull it off.
Yeah, and you know that the more complicated an operation and the more people are involved in it, you have more opportunity for it to go pear-shaped. And it doesn't. They pull it off, even with all the little hiccups in there, including having those two gents get rolled up, and then the noise on the rescue itself, all of that stuff. Again, they had the foresight to coordinate the artillery support, the anti-aircraft fire, to cover the noise, like you said, that they had been patrolling across the Rhine into that area to sensitize the Germans. Hey, we're here. If you mess around here, we're going to make you pay. So it kind of puts the scare into them to keep them away from the area. But all of it is so complicated, and still they managed to pull it off. And
in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And it did, I think, so from my perspective, my thoughts on it is it deserves far more recognition. It deserves a film made about it. But that kind of gets overtaken by everybody's enthusiasm for Market Garden. And so when you guide Market Garden, everybody wants to do Operation Market Garden, and especially this last year because it was the 80th anniversary. And then when you come to say, okay, let's do something about Pegasus, it Market Garden overtakes it, but it is such a good story. It really,
it's very, I think the ability to balance it all is very tough when you're guiding. You have a limited time with your folks that you want, and you want to foot stomp a lot of things. Like, I know that I don't get to give the Battle of Arnhem as much time as we should, because obviously a lot of the tours that I do are focused on the American airborne side of it. But that does allow us to talk about Pegasus because they're a component of it. And we're not beholden to the 22nd of September as our stop point. You know what I mean? I mean, we do go up, and I do the Battle of Arnhem in very, very broad strokes, not like you guys do. But I'm able to come back to the other side, and we do the Crossroads, and then right after that we do Pegasus, because it's a logical component for the airborne in that area. So it's completely understandable. We can always try and do better, though. I mean, that's all you can do is trying to product improve as you go along. But speaking of which, what are you guys up to now? I know, Edwin, you guide for World War II Museum when they're in town. Joe, I know you guide on your own as well. Where can everybody find you guys when they want to book you?
Yeah. So we both got websites. So I've got a website under my own name, but I work for him as well. So Ed has a company called Battlefield Discovery.
Yep.
So you could.
And I'll have the links for both your web pages in the episode description. But you guys got you've guys got an effort that you're working together that you wanted to talk about briefly, don't you?
Oh yeah, yeah.
We do.
do.
So we came up with the idea of, this was last year, of launching an After Arnhem tour. And it's a little bit different than, I suppose, doing Market Garden, because we do more on the personal stories, because obviously when you're guiding Market Garden, first of all the bridges are still there, all those iconic bridges that are focused on the film, A Bridge Too Far and what have you. And more people are aware of Market Garden because of the film. It's an iconic film. But Pegasus, people aren't as aware of it. So we came up with the idea of doing a tour called After Arnhem that would feature Market Garden on its first day, so that we would lay down the foundations, let's say, for want of a better expression,
but through the eyes of those involved in escape innovation later. So it's not the narrative of Market Garden per se. We use the narrative of Market Garden to introduce the characters and how what their experience during Market Garden, the Battle of Arnhem, was.
To set the story.
Well, I think it'll be a winner. I mean, because just sitting here talking with the two of you and all the very personal stories that are interwoven into the broader Operation Pegasus storyline, I can tell it's going to be a winner. Especially, your relationship with Tony Hibbert is a lot like my relationship with a lot of the Easy Company men. It's a very personal one, where you've had to sit down with them and talk to them and write letters to them or call them on the phone, and you begin to absorb a lot of the little details that really make for great story. And I'm not trying to downplay that this is their lives we're talking about, but it allows, like we talked about, to take a little bit of that ownership and internalize that story and make it very special, and provide it a lot more meaning than sitting there and looking at arrows on a map where this army went this way and this army went that way. Whereas now you're very grounded in a very personal story, and I think you guys tell those stories really well, and I hope people will take advantage of the opportunity to go out with you guys, two very top-notch historians and guides, and learn the story at a very tactical, very personal, very organic level.
Yeah, I mean, we do use a lot of maps. So the first day is really scene setting and bringing in those personalities, and then the next 2-3 days.
The next day is Operation Pegasus. It's purely Operation Pegasus, following in the footsteps of some of the people we've been talking about now.
So we take our guests
following that route.
We take our guests to Velp, where Tony Dean Drummond was in the cupboard, where Tony Hibbert went through. Then we go up to Brummen, where the post office is, where they were actually Tony made his escape and those soldiers were killed. Then we go to Ada, and you see the house. The house is still there where Tatham Water was and where Tony Hibbert was. We take you to the power station where they made that vital connection, the voice and Airy Neve.
And some other stories of people who haven't discussed now.
We bring in some other stories, people we haven't discussed, obviously, because we haven't had the time. But then on our last day, we follow the actual route. So we take you to the collection point, we take you down to the barn, and then we take you to Point Digby.
Well, like I said, I hope people take advantage of the opportunity to go out with you guys, because just sitting here and talking with the both of you and working our way through Pegasus from start to finish has really been a whirlwind in a great way, and very informative. I know folks are going to get a lot out of this, again, because I mean, really, it's the pop culture viewpoint right now. And I think by setting the record straight, and again, we're not bashing the miniseries. You cannot downplay what the miniseries has done for World War II history interest. And it all has to be properly viewed through the proper optic of reality versus entertainment. But in this case, you guys have helped me over the better part of almost 2 hours to bring reality to pop culture. And hopefully people will take this, and when they watch Band, they'll watch it with a little more discerning eye for that particular episode, but they'll also be interested enough to go out and maybe book a tour with me or book a tour with you guys and go out and see the sites and I really understand because, and I always say it to when my folks come out with me, I said, you can't understand a battle until you stand on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think once you guys start putting people through their paces along the routes, and they'll get a bit much better understanding of that, like that complexity that we talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And
that After Arnhem tour last year was I thought was quite a success.
It's an
You know, and as you
inaugural, wasn't
and
it?
it's an inaugural. We did it in a very select group. Was quite a success, and yeah, as you said, you know, there's certainly merit for a tour like this. So this year in October, we're going to organize another one, which will be, you know, open for anybody who wants to join.
Yep.
Of course, limited seats, but taking you to those places of Operation Pegasus, but also some of the other escape stories after Pegasus. People got out via different other means and ways, you know, sometimes even up till April 1945 before they escaped.
So 80 years ago today, and for the next few months, those men were still being hidden by the Dutch.
Yeah, trying to
so
escape.
if you're interested in going out and seeing these spots and traveling with Joe and Edwin, make sure you touch base with them. Again, I'll have their links for their web pages. So you can touch base with them and find out all the details about the upcoming tours for them. For everyone, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/. We're Not Lost Private Podcast. It's $3 a month if you want to become a supporter. You'll have access to all kinds of pictures and paperwork, my newsletter, and all kinds of little extras. You can find the We're Not Lost Private Podcast on YouTube, Amazon Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much any podcast catcher you listen to. Joe, Edwin, thanks so much again, guys. This has just been amazing, very eye-opening. I mean, I knew a little bit of the stories, and I knew some of what you guys were going to talk about, but I definitely didn't know it, and a lot of the really granular detail that you guys know it, and it's been such a treat. And I hope everybody gets something out of this. Any last words? Anything else to cover before we say goodbye?
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
It's
Was
such a
was
pleasure.
pleasure.
Hey, we're gonna have to do this again. We'll crash on a topic and maybe get you guys on when your schedule's free. And you guys are kind of in the download from touring season, right? So you got a little time to work with. Great. I will definitely touch base with you, and we'll see if we can get you guys on to talk about something else. And I hope everybody got something out of the preamble, which Joe's very passionate to talk about Auschwitz. And Edwin's personal connection to it. Thanks again, everyone, for listening or watching, and we'll see you for episode 27, which is going to be the U.S. Army Rangers in participation in Operation Torch in 1942. I hope everybody will stop by for that. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.